April 17, 1961. Bay of Pigs, Cuba. Under the cloak of darkness, a small force of Cuban exiles, trained and funded by the United States, landed on the beaches of Cuba. Their mission: to spark a popular uprising against Fidel Castro's communist regime and liberate their homeland. This was Operation Pluto, a covert invasion meticulously planned by the CIA and inherited by the young administration of President John F. Kennedy. The plan promised a swift, decisive victory. Cuban citizens, oppressed by Castro, would rise up to support the invaders, and the regime would crumble. The atmosphere in Washington was charged with Cold War tension. The rise of communism, just 90 miles from Florida, was seen as an intolerable threat. Kennedy, eager to demonstrate strength after a perceived weakness in the Eisenhower years, felt immense pressure to act. But the promise of liberation was built on a foundation of flawed assumptions, wishful thinking, and a dangerous psychological phenomenon that would lead to one of America's most humiliating foreign policy blunders. The invaders, known as Brigade 2506, were outnumbered, outgunned, and lacked the promised air support. The local population did not rise up. Within 72 hours, the invasion force was crushed. Over 1,100 men were captured, and nearly 100 were killed. This wasn't just a military miscalculation. This was a profound psychological collapse in decision-making. The psychology of groupthink within the highest echelons of power. The psychology of overconfidence that blinded leaders to reality. The psychology of suppressed dissent that silenced critical voices. This is the story of how a powerful group, under immense pressure, became so cohesive and so convinced of its own infallibility that it ignored all warnings, dismissed all doubts, and plunged headlong into a catastrophic failure, leaving a bitter legacy of regret and recrimination. The Bay of Pigs invasion became a textbook example of groupthink, a psychological phenomenon where a highly cohesive group, under pressure, prioritizes harmony over critical evaluation. The seeds of this folly were sown within Kennedy's best and brightest advisory team. This group developed a powerful illusion of invulnerability. Convinced of their collective intellect and America's might, they believed failure against a small nation like Cuba was impossible. This overconfidence led to excessive optimism and a dangerous underestimation of risks. They also held a strong belief in the inherent morality of overthrowing Castro, which shielded them from critical self-reflection. The inner circle was highly cohesive, eager to prove themselves to the young president. This cohesion, combined with the relative isolation of the planning process, fostered an environment where challenging the group's consensus became difficult. Kennedy, inheriting the plan and under pressure to act decisively, subtly encouraged action, further discouraging dissent. Optimistic scenarios, largely unexamined, became the bedrock of the plan. The group's collective confidence amplified these projections, minimizing potential weaknesses. This psychological environment, characterized by an illusion of invulnerability and a strong desire for group harmony, laid the groundwork for a series of critical errors in judgment, blinding the best and brightest to their own collective flaws. April 1961. A dimly lit room in Washington, D.C. here. Some of the brightest minds of a generation, President Kennedy's trusted advisors, are gathered. The air is thick with anticipation and cigarette smoke. Maps are spread across the table, outlining a daring plan to overthrow Fidel Castro's regime in Cuba. This was the Bay of Pigs invasion, a military operation that would become a textbook example of catastrophic failure. But what went wrong? It wasn't just a failure of military strategy. It was a failure of the mind, a phenomenon we now call groupthink. Let's dive into the psychology behind this disaster. First, confirmation bias took hold. The CIA presented intelligence that painted a picture of widespread Cuban discontent, suggesting a popular uprising would support the invading force. Reports from the State Department, however, warned that Castro's support was strong and the plan was built on false hope. But in the rush to act, These dissenting views were sidelined. The group selectively focused on information that confirmed their existing belief that the invasion would be a swift success. It's a classic trap. We see what we want to see. Then came self-censorship. Imagine being in that room, surrounded by powerful, confident figures. Arthur Schlesinger Jr., a key Kennedy advisor, later wrote about his deep misgivings. He saw the flaws, the overconfidence, the wishful thinking. Yet, he stayed silent. He later lamented his own failure to speak up, admitting he was intimidated by the apparent consensus. In high-stakes environments, the pressure to conform is immense. Doubts are swallowed, and silence is mistaken for agreement. Each person assumes they are the only one with reservations, creating a spiral of silence that reinforces a flawed decision. Guarding this fragile consensus were the Mindguards. These are individuals who actively protect the group from dissenting information. In this case, Attorney General Robert Kennedy, the president's own brother, took on this role. He was fiercely loyal and protective of his brother's administration. When one official expressed doubts, Kennedy reportedly took him aside and said, "You may be right or you may be wrong, but the president has made his mind up. Don't push it any further. Now is the time for everyone to help him all they can." This wasn't malicious. It was a well-intentioned effort to maintain unity, but it effectively shut down critical debate when it was needed most. With dissent silenced, the group began to rationalize the plan's obvious flaws. Concerns about the difficult terrain of the landing beaches or the vulnerability of the air support were dismissed with a wave of the hand. They told themselves that the element of surprise would overcome any logistical hurdles. They believed in their own inherent morality and invincibility, creating a shared illusion that everything would magically fall into place. They weren't just planning an invasion, they were crafting a narrative of inevitable victory, and any fact that didn't fit that narrative was simply ignored or explained away. Crucially, there was no one assigned the role of a devil's advocate, someone whose job was to actively challenge assumptions and poke holes in the plan. The group became an echo chamber, isolated from outside perspectives, and focused entirely on how to execute the mission, not whether they should execute it in the first place. The discussion was about tactics, not the fundamental premise. This lack of a critical counterpoint allowed a deeply flawed strategy to move forward without a single, rigorous challenge from within. The result was a disaster. The invasion was crushed within days. The expected popular uprising never happened. The Kennedy administration suffered a humiliating defeat on the world stage. The Bay of Pigs serves as a powerful and somber lesson. It shows how a group of intelligent, well-meaning individuals can collectively make a terrible decision. Confirmation bias, self-censorship, Mindguards, rationalization, and a lack of dissent all combine to create a perfect storm of poor judgment. It's a timeless warning about the dangers of unchecked consensus and the critical importance of fostering environments where doubt is not just tolerated, but encouraged. Thanks for watching. And if you found this exploration of groupthink insightful, be sure to subscribe for more deep dives into history and human psychology. April 17, 1961. The invasion began. The psychological flaws that had plagued the planning phase now manifested in a brutal, real-world failure. Escalation of commitment. Once the invasion was launched, the psychological phenomenon of escalation of commitment took hold. The Kennedy administration had invested significant political capital, resources, and reputation into the plan. To back down or admit failure once the operation was underway became incredibly difficult. There was a desperate desire to salvage the mission, even as it rapidly unraveled. This led to frantic, last-minute debates about providing air cover, despite Kennedy's earlier decision to limit direct U.S. involvement. The sunk costs, both tangible and intangible, made it psychologically harder to cut losses. The reality of the battlefield, the optimistic assumptions of the planning room quickly dissolved under the harsh reality of the Cuban coast. No popular uprising. The local population did not rise up. Castro's intelligence was superior, and his forces were prepared. The fundamental assumption of the plan that the Cuban people would welcome the invaders was a complete psychological misjudgment, fueled by wishful thinking and confirmation bias. Overwhelmed forces, Brigade 2506, numbering around 1,400 men, was quickly overwhelmed by Castro's 20,000-strong military and militia. The CIA's intelligence had drastically underestimated Castro's strength and popular support. Lack of air cover. The limited air cover provided by the exiles B-26 bombers was quickly neutralized by Castro's Air Force. Kennedy's decision to cancel a second wave of U.S. air support, fearing overt U.S. involvement, sealed the fate of the brigade. This decision, while politically understandable, was a direct consequence of the flawed plan that required such support to begin with. The blame game and fundamental attribution error. In the immediate aftermath, the psychological response was one of shock, humiliation, and a desperate search for blame. The administration initially tried to attribute the failure to external factors, the lack of sufficient air cover, the unexpected strength of Castro's forces, or even the weather. This is a classic example of the fundamental attribution error, where individuals tend to overemphasize dispositional internal explanations for others' failures while underemphasizing situational external explanations. In this case, the failure was attributed to external military factors rather than the internal systemic flaws in the planning process and the psychological biases that drove it. Cognitive dissonance post-failure. For those who had championed the plan, the failure created immense cognitive dissonance. To reconcile their belief in their own competence and the righteousness of their cause with such a spectacular defeat, they had to find justifications. Blaming the lack of air cover or the weakness of the exiles served this purpose, allowing them to avoid the more painful truth that the plan itself was fundamentally flawed due to their own groupthink. The Bay of Pigs was a swift, brutal lesson in the consequences of unchecked psychological biases. The illusion of invulnerability, the suppression of dissent, and the desperate commitment to a failing course of action led to a military and political catastrophe that reverberated across the globe, forever staining the early days of the Kennedy presidency. April 19, 1961. The Bay of Pigs invasion was over. A humiliating defeat for the United States. The aftermath was a period of intense introspection for the Kennedy administration. Kennedy himself took full responsibility for the failure, a move that, paradoxically, enhanced his public image. However, the private lessons learned were far more profound, particularly regarding the dangers of groupthink. The lessons are stark. The peril of groupthink. The Bay of Pigs became a textbook case study, demonstrating how a highly cohesive group, under pressure, can make disastrous decisions by prioritizing harmony over critical thinking. It highlighted the dangers of an illusion of unanimity and the suppression of dissent. The importance of diverse perspectives. The failure underscored the necessity of including diverse viewpoints and actively seeking out dissenting opinions, even if they are uncomfortable. Kennedy later made efforts to ensure a devil's advocate was present in future high-stakes discussions, challenging authority and psychological safety. The disaster revealed the critical need for an environment where subordinates feel safe to challenge superiors without fear of reprisal. A strong authority gradient can be deadly in decision-making. Vigilance against confirmation bias. Leaders must actively guard against the tendency to seek out information that confirms existing beliefs and to dismiss contradictory evidence. Humility in power. The illusion of invulnerability, born of overconfidence, was shattered. It taught a powerful lesson in humility, reminding even the most powerful nations of their fallibility. The Bay of Pigs was a bitter pill for the young Kennedy administration, but it served as a crucial learning experience. The psychological mechanisms that led to its failure, groupthink, overconfidence, suppressed dissent, are not unique to Cold War politics. They exist in boardrooms, military commands, and even small teams today. The question is, and how could they be so wrong? The question is, where in my own life, or in the groups I'm part of, am I seeing signs of groupthink, a reluctance to challenge consensus, or a tendency to ignore uncomfortable truths? Am I prioritizing harmony over honest critique? Am I allowing an illusion of invulnerability to cloud my judgment? The Bay of Pigs stands as the timeless warning. The greatest threats to sound decision-making often come not from external enemies, but from the unseen psychological forces within ourselves and our groups.